If there is one idea that has not only survived but gained momentum through the political catastrophes of the 20th century, it is social justice. Over the last 100 years, state power has grown at an unprecedented rate. The burden of public spending has continued to increase, even in countries with a deep-rooted liberal tradition, such as the United States and England. Bureaucracy and planning mark the lives of citizens who have offered little opposition, precisely because they have fallen under the spell of social justice. Today, tanks and bombs are no longer needed to curtail freedom. It is enough to wave the flag of social justice to achieve citizen surrender to political power. 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, centralized planning is in excellent health, and it owes this to so-called social justice, that dangerous mirage which, in the words of Nobel Prize-winning economist Friedrich Hayek, is neither social nor justice. The pension system is, by far, the cornerstone of our so-called welfare state and the spearhead of social justice. 1 in every 3 euros of public spending goes to this item. However, despite the enormous amount of resources it consumes, few seem to be happy with how it works. Those responsible for it know that it is unsustainable, but they also know the enormous electoral weight that retirees carry. For their part, citizens suffer from its shortcomings on a daily basis and, after a lifetime of contributions, demand continuous improvement in their conditions. Both sides are caught up in a never-ending cycle that prevents them from denouncing the very nature of the current pension system. Worse still, it makes others assume that there is no alternative.
There are 2 basic financial methods that can even be combined. The pay-as-you-go system, which consists of paying current pensions with current contributions, and the funded pension system, in which these contributions or payments are accumulated and invested in the financial markets. When the time comes to retire, this entire fund, this pension piggy bank, which is nominal and belongs to each worker, is converted into a life annuity.
The pension system in Spain is a purely contributory pay-as-you-go system, one of the purest in Europe, I would say.
What does this mean? It means that the contributions made to the system each year by those who are working, the active population, are spent entirely that same year on paying pensions to retirees. In other words, money is taken from those of us who are working and spent entirely on paying the pensions of retirees and other pensioners. That is why it is called a pay-as-you-go system. In other words, there are no accumulated savings.
Social Security as we know it today appeared nominally in the 1880s in Bismarck's newly reunified Germany, and it remains today, with Social Security extended to all countries around the world.
In my opinion, Bismarck is a key figure, an almost diabolical being who was the first to introduce the pay-as-you-go pension system and, with it, the welfare state. Others have since copied him, but only for purely political reasons.
When Chancellor Otto von Bismarck created the first public pension system at the end of the 19th century, he set the retirement age at 70. As life expectancy was around 45 years, there were hardly any pensioners, and the money collected ended up in the state coffers. Beyond the economic benefit, Bismarck also managed to win over the working class and thereby neutralize the rise of the left-wing socialist opposition. But the true intentions behind this measure came to light in the parliamentary debate prior to its approval, when Eugen Richter, leader of the liberal opposition, asked Bismarck, "Sir Chancellor, are you aware that if this bill goes ahead, it will make the entire German people dependent on the state for life?" Bismarck, then asked to speak, stood up and replied, "That is precisely my goal."
In fact, there are many other anecdotes that make Bismarck's true intentions clear and show how he did everything he could to win over the working class by presenting the state as a social institution created for their benefit. This narrative was carefully constructed and repeated over time. And this is worth noting, because almost everyone today believes that the state was created for the common good.
Far from being beneficiaries of the welfare state, many citizens, just as Bismarck intended, have ended up being subjects of a system that is, in essence, the same as the one devised by the German Chancellor a century and a half ago. Today, in Spain, almost 70% of retirees live solely on their pension payments. And what is worse, these depend exclusively on the political decisions of the day.
Your Social Security card represents an insurance policy, a policy through which you can build a foundation of security for yourself and your family.
Look at the semantic trap. Social security. Who is going to be against something that is social and also secure? Well, if anything characterizes social security, it is that it is neither secure nor social. In other words, it is not secure. There is no real security, because there is no legal guarantee that tomorrow we will receive the pensions that our politicians have promised us.
Despite widespread opinion, the monthly contributions paid by workers are spent entirely on paying the pensions of retirees in that same month, without generating any kind of future rights or guarantees. When current workers reach retirement age, they will have no choice but to trust the decisions of the politician in power and hope that economic conditions at that time are favorable, as was the case in 1935, for example, when Roosevelt established modern Social Security in the United States. At that time, for every pensioner, the government had 52 active workers, so it was extremely easy to convince the population of the benefits of a system that, despite having no real guarantees, offered conditions that were difficult to refuse. Such was the case of the first American pensioner, Ida Mae Fuller, who, having contributed just $25 to Social Security, received the substantial sum of $22,889. Her story featured in many government advertising campaigns. Today, however, economic conditions have changed significantly. Far from the 52 active workers that Roosevelt had to pay the pension of a single retiree, today the average in both the United States and Europe has fallen to 2.
In the Spanish system, the pensions of current retirees are paid for by today's workers. And those workers are promised that in 15, 20 or 30 years when they retire, contributions will be collected from future workers to pay for their pensions.
There are already many inconsistencies here. Inconsistencies that cause the system to falter, as it is based solely on promises, and those promises can be blown away at any moment. There is nothing real backing this pension system today.
It is not secure, there is no security, but it is also not social, because most of the contributions are paid by the most vulnerable, the workers with the lowest wages. And in aggregate terms, workers are paying on average for pensions that are higher than the wages they themselves receive. So what we have here is a transfer of income from the poorest to the richest, in aggregate terms, who are the retirees.
In Spain, the architect of the welfare state was the dictator Francisco Franco. Thanks to this, his regime remained in place for almost 40 years with complete stability. All current social policies, from education and healthcare to labor legislation and the pay-as-you-go pension system, have their direct origins in Francoism, even though it is politically correct today to argue the opposite.
Let's debunk some myths about what Franco did and what he did not do.
Progressive laws in this area already existed as early as 1883. In fact, Article 46 of the 1931 Constitution of the Second Spanish Republic established Social Security as a priority for the first time in the country's constitution.
If we go back to the origins, we can look as far as 1883 with the creation of early social commissions, or to 1900 when the National Institute of Social Insurance began to emerge. But these were not compulsory or universal systems, and they were private in nature. We therefore have to wait until much later, because although a compulsory insurance system was announced during the Second Republic, it was never implemented. The modern system is finally introduced with the 1939 law, which clearly adopts a pay-as-you-go model.
In the document declaring his allegiance to the rebels, Franco made social justice and the redistribution of wealth two of his main demands. It would not take him long to implement them. Throughout the Civil War and the territories he was winning, their implementation would be one of his main assets in winning over a large part of the population, terrified by the communist policies of the other side. A good example was precisely the end of the funded retirement system in the Workers' Retirement Fund, which had been enforced throughout Spain until then. Once the war was won, Franco never abandoned his belief in social justice. An enemy of both communism and libertarianism, he made social policies the cornerstone of his regime and used them to build not only the Spanish social security system, but also the collective imagination that still sustains it today.
The great trick pulled by Roosevelt, as Franco did in Spain, was to create the fiction that there is a separate Social Security account. In reality, there is no separation at all. Everything goes to the state.
Where does Social Security get its income? From the same place as all other agencies, from public revenues. So believing in the fiction that on the one hand there is the state, and on the other Social Security, and that Social Security has autonomous income in the form of social contributions that must cover its expenses is absurd because it is a lie. In fact, if such a system really existed, it would have gone bankrupt.
What does the pension reserve fund actually contain? Many people imagine it as a piggy bank full of cash. In reality, it mainly holds Spanish government bonds. In the past, it may have held some Dutch or French debt, but today it is essentially Spanish government debt. The state injects billions of euros into the fund, and the fund uses that money to buy government bonds, returning the money to the state itself. Do those bonds yield interest? Yes. But that interest is paid with more government bonds.
It is a circular argument. From an accounting point of view, if a company did this, it would put its CFO in jail. It would be as if a family had two checking accounts and was lending money from one to the other in a circular fashion. We can all see that this would be completely illogical. Well, that was the pension piggy bank.
As we have seen, at the first sign of a serious crisis, the fund begins to be depleted over time, although this process takes several years due to the system's resilience. And if it has not been fully exhausted, it is because no politician wants to be responsible for spending the last cent of the reserve fund of the...
The fact that the famous pension reserve fund has been found to be empty is not the most serious issue. The worst aspect is that this grand fiction, perpetuated for years by successive governments, has directly discouraged private savings, which are the driving force behind prosperous societies. By leading the population to believe that their contributions were being kept in a separate account that would serve to secure their future pensions, the main reason for people to save, which was precisely to save for their old age, has been undermined.
The fact is that, to the extent that those of us who are now working trust that when the time comes for us to retire, our children and grandchildren will do the same as we are doing now, that is, finance retirees. To that same extent, it would not be necessary to save.
All of this decapitalizes society. Saving for pensions should be long-term saving, the kind of saving that allows a country to build capital and plan for the future. It is much more solid than short-term saving, but the system discourages it almost completely.
And this has a very detrimental effect on economic development, because a lower savings rate means less investment, less equipment, less capital available per worker, and therefore lower productivity and lower wages.
We have told people, you don't need to save because the state will provide for you. And it's true. It's true that this has discouraged saving, but it's also true that the state is providing very good public pensions to those who are entitled to them.
The replacement rate is the percentage of the retirement pension relative to the last salary received during the working life. Looking at data from neighboring countries, there is no doubt that pensions in the Spanish system are relatively high. More specifically, in 2017, the Bank of Spain estimated that, on average, for every euro contributed, no less than €1.74 in benefits would be received once.
With what is contributed over a working lifetime, that type of pension would probably not be affordable. That is the point we are making. I'm not saying pensions are generous. Not at all. A funded pension system would probably be more generous, but it also requires higher levels of saving. People often complain about the Chilean system, saying pensions are low. But Chilean pensions are built on a 10% contribution rate, while here we are talking about around 36%.
Many people will say, yes, the pension system has discouraged saving, and what we have done is save through housing, and in financial terms we have said, the state protects us. But the real savings we accumulate are not just for collecting a monthly payment. They are for building a life plan, for building family wealth, for leaving it to our loved ones. And not only to leave it to them when we die, but to acquire assets, to have a backup that at a given moment can serve as collateral for a loan, for a life project, a business project, or to help your family. None of this is provided by the public system, and it is essential, especially for lower-income families.
We can see, therefore, how it is all a vicious circle. A system based on coercion that harms the most vulnerable above all, destroys savings, and slows down capital accumulation and economic development to the detriment of the working classes, who are finding it increasingly difficult to finance the system and are bearing an ever heavier burden.
The final argument put forward by defenders of the current pay-as-you-go system is that it acts as a safety net for those with fewer resources. However, this claim is highly dubious. Aside from the lack of confidence shown in people from humble backgrounds to get ahead on their own, the reality is that the pay-as-you-go system, far from helping them, seriously harms them. If we take as an example a Spanish worker with a net salary of €1,250, we see that the current system is deducting no less than €750 per month from their paycheck. This money is basically used to pay the pensions of current retirees, and, as we have seen, does not guarantee that when the time comes to collect their pension, they will be able to do so with any minimum guarantees. If the system were to change, and the worker were able to freely invest that same amount in a fund with an average return of, say, 5.5%, they could retire with more than €1.5 million in assets and an after-tax pension of €41,800 compared to the €11,500 they would end up with under the current pay-as-you-go system. We can see that the change is radical, yet the effort would be the same.
For me, one of the great myths of the pension system is that contributions are not paid by the worker and that they come from the part paid by the employer, which, if you look at the percentages, is higher than the worker's part. But we already know that this is not true.
This is important because politicians, in order to keep the true cost of the system hidden and be able to sell it to the population, so that society peacefully accepts the coercion to which it is subjected, spread the idea that most of the contributions were paid by the employer.
Vendió que las contribuciones, la mayor parte las pagaba la empresa.
No, paga siempre el trabajador.
In the end, it is always the worker who pays. When employers calculate the cost of a worker, they add up all the costs: salary, contributions, safety, vacations, and other obligations. They make an overall calculation of what that worker is expected to produce, and from there they distribute that amount between salary, pensions, and the rest of the costs.
That is why it would be very important to raise all salaries to their gross amount, so that it would be clear to all citizens that, in reality, they are earning much more. Specifically, they are earning around 37% more, but that 37% is taken away to pay for that year's pensions through the pay-as-you-go system.
In Spain, for example, a person who earns 1,500 euros gross on their paycheck actually has a salary of around 2,000 euros, which is the contribution base used to calculate their future pension. The difference is paid by the employer, who is already assuming approximately 25% of the salary in taxes and social contributions. We should take this into account to really understand how much we are earning, even if we do not see it directly reflected on our paycheck. Out of those 1,500 euros gross, we are ultimately left with around 1,250 euros net. I am talking about an average salary, and we live our day-to-day lives on that amount. In addition, of everything we consume, approximately 20% goes to other taxes, such as VAT. In short, around 50% of a person's salary ends up going to taxes over time. Over a full working life, this represents around €500,000 euros for an average salary. And the question I ask is this: is that person less capable than the welfare state of managing that €500,000 euros and paying for their pension, education, or healthcare?
The fact is that the pay-as-you-go pension system is based on an outdated form of paternalism which, if we think about it carefully, is essentially incompatible with what a healthy and mature democracy should be. Because on the one hand, we are considered mature and responsible enough to vote every 4 years and elect our leaders, to take decisions that affect the political and economic life of the country. And yet, when it comes to providing for our own retirement, the state suddenly changes its tone. It tells us that we cannot be trusted to plan ahead, and that we must therefore be forced into this system, whether we want it or not, because otherwise we would not be able to provide ourselves with sufficient pensions.
Precisely. The forced incorporation of all citizens into the system is the theoretical key to its own maintenance. What differentiates our current pay-as-you-go system from any typical pyramid scheme is that the great swindlers of history have not been able to force anyone to participate in their activity. People like Ponzi and Madoff were forced to constantly seek out unsuspecting victims to expand the base of their pyramid. However, sooner or later, the deception was always uncovered.
¿Por qué es tan popular la seguridad social?
Why is social security so popular, to the point that it is considered the very foundation of the so-called welfare state? Precisely for the same reasons that pyramid schemes are so popular, especially in their early stages. At first glance, it appears that the squaring of the circle has been achieved, a system that promises returns far higher than anything available on the market, and, moreover, seemingly without cost or risk. Each participant appears to receive a very high return, a return that feels safe, stable, and guaranteed. But in reality, this return is not generated by real savings or real investment. It is paid for by the naive people who enter the system later and who are required to keep it running. If such a situation could last indefinitely, then it would, indeed, be paradise. Why work? Madoff, Doña Baldomera, or Ponzi would have discovered the solution to all our problems. But of course, when a system is based on deception rather than on real capital accumulation and genuine value creation, it cannot last. Sooner or later it collapses, and everyone who is caught inside loses their investment. Well, something very similar happens with Social Security. It is enormously popular because politicians promise extraordinary pensions and benefits, offering a tremendous apparent return, far greater than the value of what has actually been contributed. And it also seems to solve the classic weakness of pyramid schemes, the need for a constant inflow of new participants. In this case, that inflow is guaranteed by law, because the population itself is compelled to participate.
El envejecimiento paulatino de la población.
Two unique demographic phenomena are now occurring simultaneously. On the one hand, we live in a society where unprecedented developments are taking place. An extremely low number of children per woman, and at the same time, an extremely high life expectancy. People have never lived as long as they do today. Together, these two factors create a society that takes longer to lose population, because people live longer, but at the same time produces societies that are rapidly aging. Never before have societies been as aged as they are today.
Of course, this causes the cost of the pay-as-you-go pension system to grow, as I said before, in geometric progression, like a snowball. And it ends up being unsustainable.
Insostenible.
An analysis of Spanish pension expenditure over the last 20 years shows that it has indeed risen steadily. For decades, the cost of the pay-as-you-go system has been the largest item in the national budget, requiring almost 1 in every 3 euros of public spending to sustain it. So much so that the total cost of national defense would only pay for 20 days of pensions in Spain, 25 days with what is spent on public works, and barely 4 months with the entire Spanish education budget.
Precisely because it is such an important part of the public budget, there is little room for maneuver. This is obvious. There would be room for maneuver if a comprehensive reform of the state were carried out, as I would do, but that does not seem to be on the agenda of any of the current political parties. Therefore, the room for maneuver to spend more on pensions, which would basically mean increasing their weight in relation to overall public spending, is very limited.
In addition, there is a deficit. What does this mean? It means that what is being spent to pay pensioners compared to what is being paid in by those of us who are working has been increasing over the last 10 years. And to put it in context, from 2011 to 2018, that deficit, that is the accumulated difference, amounts to just over 100 billion euros.
It was foreseeable, but because it was a very gradual process, when politicians began to see the warning signs 30 or 40 years ago, they said, well, it's not my responsibility. As a result, the problem continued to deteriorate over time until we reached the current situation in which Social Security in Spain has a very large deficit. And it will be even worse in the future because structurally, the trend points to an even greater deficit and a shrinking ratio between the working population and retirees.
This growing gap between the increasingly scarce workers who have to pay for the pensions of the increasingly numerous retirees inevitably leads to social conflict. The interests of both sides prove to be irreconcilable. No matter how much concepts such as intergenerational solidarity, the welfare state, or social justice are bandied about in an attempt to soften the conflict.
In a democracy, there are 3 groups within the population: the working population that produces wealth, the retired population, and children and young people who are not yet adults and who represent the future. However, the latter do not vote. Those who vote are the working age population and retirees. So if, in a society, a very large share of the electorate consists of people who want those who work to give them more money, whether through pensions or other transfers, this can lead to the crushing of the productive part of society.
I understand that pensioners earn little and ask for more. But we also need to ask whether what is being demanded can be given without destroying the economic base that sustains them. Because if raising pensions undermines that base, what will pensioners receive in the end?
Ven, por tanto, que el sistema...
You can see, therefore, that what the system has done is to pit classes with irreconcilable interests against each other. Retirees and pensioners, the passive generation on the one hand, and the active generation, workers, especially the youngest and most vulnerable, on the other. And what should be a peaceful process of social cooperation, which normally occurs in the market and through voluntary agreements, becomes a minefield permanently exposed to political conflict, with the aim of gaining or maintaining power in the short term.
Queremos vivir desde
Do we
los
want to live from the age of 65 until we die, which is also increasingly longer, in that stage of our lives when we are most vulnerable and have less capacity to react, because we can no longer work, or our ability to generate income is much lower, and do so depending on the government in power? That is precisely why we must be careful with the pension system as it stands right now, because from the moment you stop working, for a large part of the population, a very high percentage of their income depends on political decisions taken at that time, decisions over which they have no real control.
Depende de lo que decida el político de turno.
In one way or another, all experts, without exception, agree that our pension system has a serious sustainability problem. However, few dare to point out that the real problem is the system itself. The most popular solutions, such as raising the retirement age or lowering the replacement rate, are like the music played by the famous violinists on the Titanic. They may make the agony more bearable, but they can never prevent disaster.
¿Qué habría que hacer para solucionar todos estos problemas?
What would need to be done to solve all these problems once and for all? The answer is very simple. A pension financing system based on a funded model would need to be re-established, a system based on savings and the accumulation of funds. This was precisely the system that General Franco abolished during the dictatorship, when he took all the funds accumulated by workers and established the pay-as-you-go system, with all the technical and ethical flaws we are familiar with.
In this way, people would regain their freedom, no longer forced to remain within the system. State paternalism would be eliminated. Each generation would be responsible for itself, unaffected by the gradual aging of the population. There would be legal certainty and a guaranteed right to receive the corresponding pensions when the time came to retire. And furthermore, in a funded pension system, not only would there be no negative effect on savings, but the accumulation of capital would be greatly encouraged, with all the social benefits that this entails.
What is now a vicious circle in the current public social security system would become a virtuous circle if social security were based on a funded system. This would solve the main technical and ethical problems and allow savings to accumulate, boosting economic development, capital accumulation, and wage growth in a self-reinforcing process. Then the debate becomes very clear, either social security or freedom.
However, there is one unavoidable problem. We cannot move from one system to another without paying the price for the mistakes already made. Thus, there will be a generation that will have to assume this historical responsibility, with the economic burden that this entails.
For at least a generation of 25 years, until current retirees die out and the active generation begins to accumulate funds, the generation that, because it so decides democratically, has to eliminate the pay-as-you-go system and move to a funded pension system will have to pay, so to speak, twice. And that is the big question. Would we be willing to make that sacrifice?
Contrary to what one might think a priori, the experience of other countries where this option has been taken is very encouraging. This was done in the 1970s, for example, in England, as a result of a grand bargain between the major parties. With an overwhelming result, 90% of citizens, as soon as they were given the freedom to do so, decided to abandon the pay-as-you-go system and opt for a funded pension system.
¿Pero en qué condiciones?
But under what conditions? For example, allowing 10 points of that 37% that is currently taken from us by force to be kept by those of us who are currently working, to be directed to a pension fund, while continuing to pay the remaining 27 as before as a sunk cost to cover the payment of pensions for retirees. What would happen in Spain if this option were available? From a budgetary point of view, the worst that could happen is that, as happened in the United Kingdom and other countries, the vast majority would opt out. So what would be the cost to the public coffers? Well, approximately 10 points out of 40, that is, a quarter of the current cost of social security, which is around 12% of GDP, would be lost. Because citizens would keep that money in their pockets to start accumulating their own funds. A quarter of 12% of GDP is 3% of GDP. This is precisely the deficit limit authorized by our agreements within the European Union. I am sure that if Spain presented a serious plan for transitioning to a funded pension system, the European Union would accept this deficit without any problem, and at most would require, in the worst-case scenario, the restructuring of public accounts in other areas of expenditure. Incidentally, and although this doesn't affect the essence of the argument, I explain this in detail in my book, Money, Bank Credit and Economic Cycles. If the financial system were reformed and a 100% reserve requirement were imposed on demand deposits and their equivalents, not only would the recurring cycles of boom and bust that now arise from the banking system's ability to create money out of thin air, without the backing of savings, all orchestrated by central banks, be avoided, but it would also make it possible to finance the transition to a funded pension system at no cost. The explanation is very simple. By consolidating 100% with newly created money, but not inflationary money because it would be sterilized to consolidate current demand deposits, the assets that currently appear on banks' balance sheets as collateral for those deposits would be freed up. Those assets could then be securitized and exchanged for outstanding public debt. In the United Kingdom, the Cobden Centre and other specialists and experts have conducted studies and concluded that the country's entire outstanding public debt could be repaid in this way. The same would be true in Spain. As a result, there would no longer be any interest to pay on that debt, because debt holders would receive, instead of interest payments, the return generated by those assets. In this way, it would be possible to offset the cost of the transition to a funded pension system, which at most would amount to around 3% of GDP. In conclusion, what is needed is a courageous political class that shuns demagoguery, tells the truth to citizens, and allows them to freely choose what they consider most appropriate. Only if this option is available will we be able to assess the extent to which the generation in question is willing to bear the cost of the transition, or whether it prefers to spread that cost more gradually over 2 generations. But in any case, a clear roadmap must be established, based, I repeat, on the truth, and we must not deviate from it in the slightest. Only then will we be able to solve what is undoubtedly the most serious social, economic and political problem afflicting our country.